I've raised this issue with our Member of Parliament, who's a Liberal Member of Parliament, several times, and nothing's happening. Now, there's a good reason why. My solution to this is put them in jail. What AMP did was breaking the law. National Bank did was breaking the law. They're not going to do it, and I'll tell you why. And I'll tell you what the solution is. It's quite complicated. They won't do it because they'll be biting the hand that feeds them. You know what I mean, don't you? The banks provide the Liberal Party and the Labour Party with election funding. And that's why the politicians are reluctant to go after these guys full scale. So the solution to all this is very simple: publicly funded elections. If we get publicly funded elections, then there's no reason for them to do these sorts of things. Anyways, Kathy, over to you.
Hear, hear. Okay, David, because it's very topical at the moment, and it sort of touches on what you said, could you comment on the Invictus Games and the fact that it is funded by huge weapons manufacturers like Raytheon, who are actually making the weapons that are causing these war injuries? Thank you.
Good point.
Business and human rights is a minefield, to use an inappropriate term. And of course, here we're involving non-financiers. These aren't banks, but nevertheless, your point is valid. When corporations do social responsibility, they often think of it as being something on the outside of what they normally do. In other words, they're paying for the Opera House, or they're paying for their name to be emblazoned on the World Cup or on any form of games. Whereas in fact what we really want from our corporations is exactly what Elizabeth Warren was saying, and that is that the corporations in their core business are doing things that benefit humanity as well as making a profit. I'm not advocating, at least not in this circumstance, advocating that we get rid of corporations and we get rid of capitalism. What I'm saying is that we've got to make capitalism more human oriented, and it's not at the moment. So I think insofar as corporations believe that they can do their human rights business by simply putting their name on games that involve people who have been damaged in the war, and that's sufficient for their social responsibility, I would say that that's fig leaf, that's lip service.
It's not quite compensation?
Well, yeah, compensation to give them the license, the social license to operate, to allow them to feel good about themselves. I mean, I'm not saying that they shouldn't do it. It's just that can't be the only thing that corporations are doing in terms of social responsibility. What you really need is what they're doing in their core business. And if their core business is indeed involved in gambling or tobacco or arms, you've got to question what sort of a corporation that is. That's difficult.
Okay.
Thank you. My name's Ken Cregan. That was a really good talk. Thank you. And I'm wondering what you might think about these new digital economies, the likes of taxi cab industry being totally revised, and Airbnb taking over rental accommodation. Do you think there's any possibility that a digital type economy running on the net by new entrepreneurs with this sort of moral values that you espouse, and perhaps using cryptocurrencies but not necessarily, do you see any possibility of something like that coming along?
Oh, it's not even a possibility, Ken, it's happening, isn't it? We can't avoid it. What I think is really interesting about the sorts of industries that you mentioned and the disruptors in those industries is that they're not state-oriented, they're not the publicly funded. They are indeed the antithesis of the public licensed or public funded entity. They are seeking to subvert what is otherwise the control that public authorities have over banking, over licensing cabs, or indeed hotels. Now that means that what will happen, at least in the interim, but it will change, because the state will react, at least in the interim, the power then shifts from, as it were, the public arena into private hands. And we're seeing this with social media. So now a lot of our privacy is not in being invaded by the state, although I'm sure the state is and can invade our privacy, but it's much more in the hands of private sector organizations like Facebook and other social media organizations What responsibilities do they have, and how do we make them responsible when we didn't elect them? Shareholders and others put them in the position that they're in. So our normal political means of control are not there anymore.
So it'll make it worse. Yeah.
Well, it might make it worse, it might make it better. Cryptocurrencies is an interesting example. Behind the cryptocurrencies is blockchain. Blockchain is a means by which, at least theoretically, you would be able to track every single transaction that's made. And as a consequence, you could, if you had the political will, track every illicit financial transaction that's made, every inappropriate tax evasion that's made. That would be a huge, if it was used in a way to prevent those, would be a huge advantage for welfare states, for states. But whether they would want to or can or have the will to do so is another matter. But these things are unavoidable now. The computerization, financialization, and indeed digitalization of our economy are unavoidable.
My name's Jim McElroy, and I think I'd like to roll back a little bit and say that what Commissioner Hayne called the culture of greed, which is exposed in the Banking Commission, we can see that goes right back to the whole neoliberal offensive which has taken place over 3 or 4 decades. Now, I just want to specifically mention one disastrous thing that happened, and that was that the Hawke-Keating Labor government sold off the Commonwealth Bank. The Commonwealth Bank was one possible institution which could have represented the public interest. Now, we can go into the issues of what happened to the Commonwealth Bank over a period of time, but because it was a public bank, it was the massive resources. Australia's largest bank probably would have been massively bigger now, even than what it is. If it had been still in public hands, we would have been in a position to exert the public interest in it. Now, I think we have got to start the process. There's no way getting around it if we're going to tackle the banking problems, ASIC, etc. That's all just part of the problem. We have got to start taking back the wealth that's been stolen. So we need to start rolling back and look at the whole thing of renationalisation and nationalisation of the banks. That is stolen money off the people. It should be in the hands of the public. And just one final point. I agree that you can't assume that a bureaucracy will do the job. We need it to be controlled by a publicly elected board of customers and stakeholders and the workers in the system who, by the way, are kind of suffering because of this system. So I think we've got to start. And the final point, that the Greens have proposed what seems to me to be a good starting point, which is a people's bank that is starting just with the little old, using the post office as a public bank, which it used to be for the Commonwealth Bank, and start to roll back. And I think vast numbers of Australians, starting with me, would take their money out of the privatised system and put it into a people's bank that was set up like tomorrow.
Yeah.
It would be a massive success, and it would be making loans and maybe housing loans first. So that's my suggestion of how we start to roll back this dreadful culture of greed. Could you comment, please?
Uber was set up by the Saudi money. That was in the media yesterday.
Of course, politics is always about the art of the possible, and and I know that at least in the short term we're not going to see renationalisation of the CBA or indeed any of the other banks. However, you're quite right in saying that did forfeit the hold, or the potential hold, or place at the table that the state had in the banking system, because it then all became privatised. Now, of course, the consequence of that privatisation has been that potentially competition would mean a benefit for customers. But what's happened in Australia, and Australia particularly, is that we've had an oligopoly. It's not a monopoly, but it's an oligopoly, and they do work in lockstep, so that you really have little choice in terms of loans and mortgages. I think I read figures of 85% of our loans and mortgages come from the top 4 banks. That's right. And they do operate in very similar, but in narrow bands of conditions and fees and interest rates and commissions. So there's really not much to choose. Where do we have choice? Well, I think one of the interesting areas is the revival in cooperative banks. Now, I know they're not what you're talking about, but cooperative banks are not making a profit for the shareholders, they're making a profit for those who have loans, who are customers. Now that, I think, is an option, and if they find their way into the mortgage market, maybe as a consequence of what we're seeing over the last 8 months, into the mortgage market that challenges the big four banks, then that might be a way forward. Now, what's happened before when small entities have done that is that the big four banks have then taken over, have bought. That what we need then, if not to re-nationalise, is, and people are making this suggestion, including the Productivity Commission, is to break up the four banks and make it less of an oligopoly. That too will be a huge political step. It won't happen quickly, if at all.
What about a People's Bank they've got it in New Zealand called Kiwi Bank that operates through the post office?
Well, you could put it.
To me, a very realistic first step, and you could start off re-establishing a public entity, and it's got the backing of the state, the backing of the Reserve Bank, if you like, so it's not going to get overrun.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, and maybe you're in a position now where people are pissed off enough, because the report comes down in February, the final report, and maybe in the years subsequent to that, people will think, yeah, I am going to take my money out. I am going to put it somewhere else than the big four. A lot of it has to do with financial literacy as well, people understanding what they can and cannot do, how difficult it is, and indeed the legislation that removes barriers that would otherwise prevent you from moving out of a big bank into a smaller financial entity. But a lot of it has also got to do with people believing that they can do it, that it's not that difficult, and that they can find ways in which to do it that doesn't cost them an arm and leg as well.
In countries where there's some semblance of democracy, it's obviously easier for people's movements and so on to try and rein in a lot of the nasty stuff that corporations do with consumer boycotts and all kinds of other measures like that. But I'm thinking that countries with a more autocratic system, it's always going to be, people are going to be much more up against it to try and do such civil and community and grassroots actions. Certainly countries like China, for instance, which has taken on capitalism, certainly in a very crony form, very much. Sort of those companies, which are in favour of the Communist Party, but haven't taken a step in the direction of human rights, and certainly the same with Russia becoming more autocratic, and the frightening situation in Brazil and many other countries. So my question is, what is the scope for such movements to rein in the nastiness and so on, at least some of the worst being aspects of corporations and so on, in countries where the state that's running it is pretty much in collusion with these big companies?
Well, I mean, the collusion is both explicit and implicit. You're right that the state-owned enterprises and even the private enterprises in China are nevertheless guided, if not controlled, by party politics, certainly if they're big enough. But you might say that the politicians of Western democracies are also in the thrall of big business and indeed of big finance, but just in a slightly different way, less overt, but still powerful enough. And indeed that might be even more dangerous because it gives the veneer that it is not inappropriate. It's open democracy, but in fact it's not open democracy, it's a sort of hijacking of the state. And indeed many economists and many financiers have really effectively said that this is a hijacking of the state by the financial sector.
Yes.
So what can we do to alter that? Well, interestingly with respect to China, the way the Chinese responded to the global financial crisis was more effective in many ways than the West because they did control their banking system. That hasn't stopped, though, the fact that they now have, and if we're looking for a place for the next financial crisis, look in China. It didn't stop the fact that the liquidity that they force their banks to provide to business and to individuals has now created an absolutely enormous local government debt in China that is sitting there like the sort of bottom part of a iceberg, ready to topple the top part of the iceberg. And if China's economy continues on its current slow decline, that may well come to fruition, and then we really are going to be in it for a very unprecedented time. How can that be used how can those sorts of countries be used or persuaded to protect human rights better? Well, you know, the orthodox view is that the more capitalist they become, the more they will drink the Kool-Aid of liberal democracy. But that's not happened. And part of that is to do with nationalism, I've no doubt. I read a report the other day done by political scientists in China, in which they really did genuinely seek to find people's opinion about how they supported their government. They interviewed nearly 4,000 Chinese, and the approval rate of government was, and I would like to think that we would never get that here, is 8 out of 10. So 8 people out of 10 approve their government. Now, they then go through the long list of reasons why we might think that's nonsense, that they've been coerced into it, they don't realise what they're doing. They've been bought off because of the high level of increase in wages and decrease of poverty. But they counter each one of those and they say, well, you know, apart, and it's a big apart, but apart from political dissent, other forms of dissent are listened to in China. You know, bad milk products, bad manufacturing, bad labour conditions. They don't like that. They do respond. Anything political that challenges the Communist Party, yeah, they will just... And torture, gulags, the whole dealing with Uyghur people in central and western China is appalling because it's political. Business, they will pay attention to. So most people are focusing on business. And they say, we're happy with that. So I don't know. And I won't go into Russia, it'll take another 10 minutes to go through that. But it's very, very complex, it really is. And we are going to have to, I suppose the final and most obvious thing I would say is we're going to have to really get used to the fact that China and Russia both are big international players that are here, back here to stay. And we're right in the middle of a crisis of confidence in our own polities, Europe, Australia, and the United States. We are really, I think we will look back in 20 years' time, maybe even 10, and think, God, we dodged a bullet, or we got the bullet, because we're not doing the best that we should at the moment. And China and Russia and other autocracies are finding their feet. It's not necessarily a good thing.
You might not be aware that the Australian government that sold the Commonwealth Bank wasn't the constitutional government. It was actually a private corporation registered in the United States pretending to be the constitutional government. So with a proper legal challenge, it can be challenged that that private corporation didn't own the bank and didn't have the right to sell it. Right? Firstly, and the next thing is that the Commonwealth government, the Commonwealth Bank up until 1959 was the central bank of Australia, controlling the Australian pound. Then the Menzies government, with the assistance of H.C. Coombs, set up the Reserve Bank of Australia and made it the central bank.
Yep.
And it appears that it's a government, constitutionally government-controlled bank, but it's actually not. It's owned by a consortium of private banks based on the Federal Reserve of the United States model.
Well, I didn't know that. I'm not entirely sure what you mean by an unconstitutional government during...
It's a private corporation registered in the United States.
What is?
Purporting the current Australian government is a private corporation registered in the United States, purporting to be...
Not the Liberal Party, but the modern format
no, it's not modern
of the government.
Okay, the Constitution of Australia Act of 1898, whatever, from Britain, right, it set up an Australian Parliament, the Commonwealth Government, right? The Commonwealth Government that we have now is not that entity. Yes. It's a private corporation purporting to be that entity. You can find it on the Securities Exchange Commission in the United States. Yeah. It's listed there. Yep. It issues prospectuses, right? It's not the real constitutional government. It's a private corporation with private owners pretending to be the constitutional Commonwealth of Australia.
It's a slightly different name, isn't it?
Well, it has the name Commonwealth of Australia
Yes,
Corporation,
yeah,
right? And it sometimes goes by the Australian Government Corporation.
yeah.
And every government agency and department is actually now, because they've been converted into private corporations with private owners, whether it's the Education Department or Housing Department or the Treasury or the Police or the Ambulance Service or hospitals, they're all private corporations
We
now.
don't believe you, Michael.
Okay, let's go online to the Securities Exchange Commission website. It's all there. It's not hidden.
No, it's true.
It's all there, and that's privately owned by private owners, individuals, and hedge funds and things like that. It's there. It's not hidden. It's there to be seen, Jefferson.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. That's an interesting point. I'm not aware of that either, and I'm not sure anyone else does either.
Yeah, I was aware of it. I've read
You were.
Yeah.
Ladies and
What
gentlemen,
it's
I
saying.
want you to put your hands together and thank our guest speaker, David, for a very
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, David.
Thank you very much. Very kind of you to come.